I was in the locker room at W.O. Strasbaugh Motor Company on Wicked Avenue in Youngstown and heard the men who were sitting around a table talking about the news of the atom bomb. The mood of the men was upbeat because they felt the war was about to end. Nobody expressed any sorrow for those killed or fear what was going to happen in the future. The bombs that were dropped on August 6th and 9th killed 900,000 people. Japan sued for peace on August 10th. I was 18 on August 12th, 1945, and registered for the draft. President Truman proclaimed August 14th as VJ Day. VJ Day was one of the days I will always remember. Gasoline had ended for all practical purposes, and Dad let me have the car. I filled up the tank and just drove around with no place in particular to go. On February 26, 1946, I was instructed by my draft board to report to the Erie Railroad Station, and I went with other men on a train to Cleveland Central Tower Building. We walked in a single file from the station in the snow to the federal courthouse induction station. I was examined and tested. I was sworn in as Private Arthur Holdford and ended up on a train going to Camp Atterbury, Indiana. I arrived in the middle of the night and was given a pep talk about enlisting in the Air Force for 18 months. Because if I stayed a draftee, I would never know when I was going to be discharged. I fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. Later I found out that the draftees were discharged a year or less after being inducted. I received the honorable discharge as a draftee on February 28, 1946, and my term of enlistment in the regular army began on March 1st. I received $100 mustering out pay. The thing I soon found out about the military was that the soldier was always made to hurry. Double time march, and then after he arrived, he waited. An orderly awoke me at 5:30 in the morning by blowing a whistle over and over again. I dressed quickly and went outside in the snow for roll call. After roll call, I marched double time to the mess hall for breakfast so I could wait 2 or 3 hours in the cold until I was allowed to go in and eat. After 4 or 5 days at Camp Atterbury, I was placed on a troop train that went to Sack Field that was outside of San Antonio, Texas. As usual, I arrived in the middle of the night and marched to the barracks. The barracks were much nicer than the ones at Camp Atterbury because Sack Field was an officers' training camp for aircraft pilots. On the night that I arrived, a group of us was asked if anyone had ROTC training. One man raised his hand and he became our flight leader, a soldier who was in charge of my group of soldiers. Basic training was not difficult because Air Force officers and men didn't do much soldiering. They were flyboys. If it rained, we stayed inside the barracks. Basic training lasted for about 6 to 8 weeks. I learned how to march, to read military manuals, and even to shoot a weapon. I didn't have to do much to qualify to handle a weapon. I went to the firing range and fired a 45mm pistol and a handheld 45mm machine gun at a target. Everyone recorded each other's score. We were told to make sure that everyone's score was high enough to qualify. Weapons training lasted 1 day. Basic training was over about May 1st, and I was assigned to a shifting squadron until it was determined to where I was to go. Shipping squadron was another name for a labor pool. Each day I worked in the kitchen doing cleaning assignments, picked up paper and cigarette butts off the ground, or just sat around. I was tested to see where I would fit in the military, was asked to give a preference. I was asked to be sent to an automobile mechanic school because I thought this might be handy after I got out. As a result, about the first week of June, I was sent to a clerk typist school at Lowry Field, Denver, Colorado. The base was a training school for B-29 bomber crews, and there were many mock-up airplanes around the field. I saw my first jet fighter, and it looked like a motor with wings. It sounded like a loud vacuum sweeper. It was a large Air Force base and had a central mess hall. Buses were used by the soldiers to go about the base. When I received a weekend pass, I went to the Rocky Mountains quite often because they were close. The mountains were visible from my barracks. Estes Park, northwest of Denver, was a favorite spot. I did a lot of thumbing, and people were very generous by picking me up. I even thumbed to the top of Pikes Peak. I'm standing on a cannon, which was at a roadside memorial. I rented horses and rode the mountain trails. I saw many mountain goats and buffaloes. The horses were difficult to handle when they saw their stable, and one time my horse saw the stable, took off on a gallop, and went directly into the stall with me still on the saddle. Clerk typist school lasted 6 weeks, and each day was very busy. Training consisted of learning how to touch type, care for a typewriter, fill out military forms, and file papers. In bed at night, my typing exercises kept repeating over and over in my head. At the time, I didn't realize how valuable the training would be for me for the rest of my life. I was in clerk typist training from July 1 to September 6th. When I graduated, I had an MOS of 405. I received shipping orders to report to Geiger Field, Spokane, Washington, and was to report there on October 1st. I went home on furlough before reporting to Spokane. My furlough was uneventful because my friends were away in the service. The trip on the train to Spokane and Washington near the Idaho border took 4 or 5 days. I found out how large the United States was. After I arrived at Geiger Field, I went into shock because I could not believe what I saw. Soldiers were marching, wearing combat boots and carrying M1 rifles. Their officers were wearing U.S. Army engineer insignias. It looked like a prisoner of war camp without walls and watchtowers. What happened? Where did the Air Force go, and where are the airplanes? The barracks were old one-story buildings that were built during the middle 1930s. The toilets and showers were a block or more away from the barracks, and 2 pot-belly stoves furnished the heat for each barrack. I found out that I was no longer in the Air Force. I was in the Aviation Engineers, a work battalion that was trained to build airplane landing strips and fields. They were preparing to go to the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. I wasn't happy at all, and this is an understatement. The winter in eastern Washington was beautiful when the snow was on the ground among the pine trees. Geiger Field was in the woods. I did not have to look out the window to see if it snowed. I just looked through the cracks between the boards of the barracks wall. It was very cold at night. The men who had cots near the stove were too hot, and the rest of us were too cold. Many a night I went to bed with my clothes on, and my overcoat was over the bed as an extra blanket. It was not easy to get up in the middle of the night to go to the toilet, and I suspect there were many a night that some didn't make it. Guess who? Some soldiers relieved themselves on the hot belly stove as a joke, and the smell was disgusting. The aviationeers were ready to leave for Alaska about February 1947, and I completed the paperwork as the soldiers loaded the railroad cars with road scrapers, motor shovels, and other pieces of heavy equipment. When they shipped out, I waved goodbye to them because I didn't have enough time remaining in my enlistment. I received orders to be transferred to Fort Francis E. Warren in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Although I didn't know it at the time, it was the future site of the United States Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Base. I went on a train from Spokane to Denver and on a Greyhound bus from Denver to Cheyenne. Fort Warren had a Victorian appearance, and it appeared that it was built during the Civil War. The streets were lined with trees, and the lawns were mowed and well maintained. The buildings were built of red bricks, and the front porches were the width of the buildings. The rooms had 12 to 14-foot ceilings, and the floors were covered with a linoleum-type material.